Alright, in this one we're going to take a look at Blender's interface because all of this can be very overwhelming if you're brand new to Blender. But we can break it down so that it's much easier to understand what is happening here. So first of all, right here, this main window is the 3D viewport. Now the 3D viewport is usually the main window as this is where you're going to be doing a lot of your animating, modeling, etc. in Blender. You can see that we have a camera, which we can select by left clicking. We have a cube, which again we could select by left clicking it, and a lamp right here. We also have an x-axis, which is the red one, a y-axis, which is the green one, and a grid floor. We also have some other panels over here and over here with different options for different functions. So this main window is the 3D viewport, and you can see that if we go to the top left, you can see it's set to 3D viewport right here. The next window down here is the timeline. Now I could go ahead and hover my mouse over here until I get the double-sided arrow and bring it up a little bit to expand it. Now the timeline, as it sounds, allows for us to play our animations or create movement with our animations. You can see that right here I can left click and drag and move or scroll through the timeline. So right now it's set to frames. And again, you can see that right now we have the starting frame 1 and the ending frame 250. Now right now, by default, it's set to 24 frames a second. So 24 of these frames is going to be 1 second of animation. So from here to here, that's 1 second of animation. From here to 48 frames is going to be 2 seconds of animation. You can see here I could click on the play button and it will play the animation or the timeline. So right now we have 250 frames, which is going to be roughly 10 seconds of animation, as you can see right there. And once again, we could see that this is set to timeline. If we click here, you can see here it is set to the timeline window right here. The next window that we have is the properties panel. Now the properties panel, once again, we can see it's set to properties by clicking here and it's set to properties. You can see that we have a bunch of different properties here. We have the render properties right here to be able to render our animations. We have the output properties to select how it's going to be rendered out. And depending on which object you select, you will have different properties. You can see right here we have the light selected. So right here we have the light or lamp properties. If we select the cube, however, you can see that we have different kinds of properties for the cube. So once again, the properties is going to give us a bunch of different properties based on these tabs and based on which object we have selected. The next window is the outliner. Now this outliner, as you can see, once again, it's set to outliner, and this will basically outline whatever we have in our 3D scene. You can see that we have a camera, a cube, and a light. Now the outliner is very useful, especially if you have a very big scene with a lot of objects, because then you could just search for that object. For example, if I type in cube, you can see that I could find the cube right here very easily by just searching for it. Also with the timeline, we could easily hide objects by clicking on this eye icon right here. So right here, this will hide it in the viewport, and then we can make it not render out. So this camera right here will basically make it invisible in the render, or make it not render out. And we have a bunch of different options as well as far as the outliner. But basically the outliner outlines whatever objects that you have in your 3D scene. And then lastly, up here, this is not too much of a window, but more of a header bar. You can see that over here we have a traditional file where we could open and save our .blends, as you can see right here. We then have an edit. Under edit, one of the most useful things under edit is the preferences. In the preferences, you could change a bunch of things such as the interface and all the different settings of Blender. Also, this is where you will find the add-ons for Blender. So right there we have the preferences. And then we have a bunch of different options over here as well. And then here from layout all the way to scripting, these are the different window presets. So right now you can see that we're on the default layout. Let's say we wanted to model. Well, we could click on the modeling layout and it will change the windows so that it's a better setup for this particular workflow. Let's say you wanted to sculpt. Well, right here you could go to sculpting and it will create a set of windows that is better for a sculpting workflow. Or if you go to animation, you can see that now we have these windows here for compositing, geometry nodes, etc. We could also change this manually if we want. So let's say, for example, we could see on the modeling workflow, it looks exactly the same, however, we don't have the timeline. Well, if I go back to the layout workflow, if I want to remove the timeline, so you can see here if I go to the corner of any of these windows that my mouse turns into a crosshair. And with this crosshair, for example, if I go to the bottom left of the 3D viewport, I can left click and drag down, and now it will basically merge the window into the timeline. So if I don't let go, you can see that I have this option to either merge the 3D viewport into the timeline, or if I go up, you can see my mouse is a small arrow. In this way, it will merge the timeline into the 3D viewport. So here, if I bring it down and let go of the mouse, it will now overtake the timeline with the 3D viewport. If I want to bring back the timeline, I could just go to the bottom left, and we could do the same kind of function to add a window back. If I left click and drag up, you can see that it adds another window right here. Now by default, it's just set to the 3D viewport, but I could click on here and change this back to the timeline. And now I have the timeline back on here. If I go here and left click and drag down and then go up, and if I let go of my mouse there, you can see that now the timeline overtakes the 3D viewport. Of course, I could change this back to the 3D viewport and then go down here, drag it up, and change this back to a timeline. And we could do this for any of these windows. You can see that right here we have a outliner and a properties. Let's say I don't want the outliner. Well, I could go to the top left corner of the properties, left click and drag up, and now it will merge the properties into the outliner and we no longer have an outliner. Now let's say we want the outliner down here instead. Well, I could go to the bottom left click and drag up, and now I have another window. Again, by default, it's going to be the same window as whatever you're dragging out from. In this case, a properties window. But I could change this to an outliner, and there we go. Very, very cool. Now let's say I want to change this back to the way it was before. I could just change this to the properties, go over here, drag this up, and then change this one to the outliner. And there we go. We have it back how it was before. So all of these up here are just different laid out structures of these windows. So you can see that this window right here is set to the image editor. This one is set to the 3D viewport, and of course this one to the properties. If we go to the geometry nodes, you can see that this one is set to the geometry node editor, and this one is set to the spreadsheet, etc. One last thing, if we want to maximize a certain window, we could hover our mouse over it and hit Control Spacebar, and it will maximize it and minimize everything else. We can hit Control Spacebar to bring everything back, and whatever window we hover over and hit Control Spacebar, it will maximize it. Now this isn't really useful for the properties. This is mainly used over the 3D viewport. Because again, with the 3D viewport, you usually want it big as you're going to be doing a lot in the 3D viewport. So maximizing this by hitting Control Spacebar in the 3D viewport really helps to get the most of the screen space. All right, so that is the interface of Blender. I'll see you in the next one. Ciao for now. Au revoir.